tonight, just sort of by way of background, I can fill you in a few details. I mainly worked on pollution at the EPA laboratory. My laboratory director, Dr. Rose Marie Russo, sits here in front of me to make sure that I don't make any more mistakes. But truly, she was an inspiration to me. And she's a member of the Catholic Center community here. I did research on the biodegradation or the breakdown of pollutants in the environment, and also looked at public health issues to do with hospital infection control, climate change, a whole range of issues, all of which tie in with St. Francis' days and his life, St. Francis of Assisi. And I wanted to read, to start out with, just a little bit of an overview that I prepared for Father John that ties in his ideals, St. Francis's ideals, with science, in particular ecology. So I'll read it here. By calling upon Catholics to protect the environment, Pope Francis recognized that environmental protection and serving the poor are inextricably intertwined. Environmental degradation impacts the poor the hardest, and children in particular. Speaking of orphans, lepers, and other outcasts who followed him, Jesus said, "Whatever you do to the least of these, my brethren, you do unto me." The world depends on science to feed the hungry, to provide clean water, to heal the sick, and to free the innocent from prison. And so science is of service to the poor in the ways that Christ talked about. And since then, the story of St. Francis, at least to me, has sort of rung a bell in this area, because early biographers talked about how that his mission in life, his calling, began when he entered into an old dilapidated church. And as he looked among the ruins, he came upon a crucifix, which he kneeled down before to pray. And when he did, he heard a voice speaking to him, saying, "Rebuild my house that's fallen into ruins." And so he set on that path then to serve the poor, to live among lepers, and live a very humble life, and not let as he viewed it, the corruption of money interfere with his service to the poor and setting an example for the poor. And so I immediately saw the analogy there with my area of science, which is mainly environmental justice, which is how pollution and other forms of environmental degradation impact primarily economically and educationally disadvantaged segments of our society. Those communities are hit the hardest by pollution. And science itself, at least in my own mind, I could clearly see how science has come under the influence of money, whether it's from big pharmaceutical companies funding universities to do research on drugs that turns out to support the safety of those drugs. That's been a big concern in the scientific community. But also coming from federal agencies. That was sort of my area in particular, was recognizing from my own experience not how things went at our laboratory on College Station Road here in Athens, where we had from the top down scientists and managers, administrators who were dedicated to public service, to put the public's interest above our own. But once you get a little closer to Washington, D.C., you see a change in that oftentimes. And so based on my 31 plus years of work at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, I got a glimpse over 30 years how EPA changed from the time it was formed in 1970 to where it is today. Things got driven more and more out of Washington, D.C. politically over time. And that transformed the agency in ways that I want to talk about tonight. That when we leave here, hopefully we'll have a better, clearer understanding from the examples I give of how the corruption of money has influenced our ability and hindered it to protect the environment, to carry out the goals of Laudato Si, Pope Francis's second encyclical, where he calls upon Catholics and others to protect the environment, our common home. So what I want to talk about first is just a big picture of pollution, because I saw it as a research scientist from within the agency. So I get to see how things transformed in ways that the general public would not pick on, would not pick up on, would not be aware of. And I want to convey that tonight. If we start off in 1970, when EPA was created as an agency, right before that, that occurred in 1970, the year before that, 1969, which is 47 years ago now, the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, Ohio, caught on fire. It was all over the news, front page of Time magazine. I was around then, I was interested in the environment, so I watched that and paid attention to it. The reason it caught on fire is because of the pollution that was being piped into that river from all sorts of industries around Cleveland. And it got so bad that it ignited one day and burned and caught national attention and actually triggered, it was an important first step in the environmental movement. It pushed it forward. And to this day, usually when you see an EPA administrator brought in and presented as the nominee of the president, he or she will often start with the story of the Cuyahoga River. But as time went on, when that problem was addressed, Congress passed the Clean Water and Clean Air Acts in the late 60s and early 70s. That made it very expensive. When EPA began to regulate pollutants in the air and water, it made it very expensive for big corporations to deal with their waste. So if you think about the big picture of it from the beginning, Congress passed a Clean Air Act, multiple Clean Air Acts, and the Clean Water Act, but there is no Clean Soil Act. So that void is there and nothing's said about it, but it became apparent to everyone in the business, the polluters, that this was their only out for getting rid of pollutants cheaply. So what happened then is that the wastewater industry and big corporations, chemical plants, petroleum plants, they got together with their lobbyists, and they began to work with Congress to push in this direction, to open the door to taking the pollutants that were going in the rivers and flowing eventually out to the oceans, to transfer those to land. From their standpoint, it made all the sense in the world. So what I witnessed in my career early on was that the Office of Water in Washington, D.C. that dealt with the water issues had developed a close working relationship with the Water Environment Federation, which is a trade organization, a huge trade organization that represents the wastewater industry, works with all the polluters that dump their industrial chemicals into the rivers that was causing the problem. And so along about 1992 and 93, this is just 23 years ago, that EPA's Office of Water proposed to EPA's Office of Research and Development, where Rose and I and others here tonight worked way back then. And what they proposed was that, and they'd worked this out with the Department of Agriculture, is that by that time, President Jimmy Carter, he had built wastewater treatment plants in the largest public works effort to date at that time. Every city and municipality from coast to coast had a wastewater treatment plant to clean up the water. And what they did is mixed it with sewage sludge, and the sewage sludge would settle out. So the pollutants were transferred from the water to the sewage sludge. So what they wanted to do, what the EPA and the wastewater industry wanted to do, was to come up with the cheapest possible way to get rid of those pollutants and to not regulate the pollutants. So what happened in the big picture of things in that framework of time from 1970 when EPA was created to 1992 was that EPA tightened its regulations on all these chemicals we worry about, pesticides, PCBs, plasticizers, the things that were in the water. But the thing to remember is the things that were in the water and in the air were in very low concentrations. They were in very low concentrations in water because the things we worry about the most are not soluble in water, not hardly at all. But what that means, the other side of that coin, is they're very soluble in fat, animal fats. That's where the problem comes because they become biomagnified up the food chain. It gets in the water, the fish pass it through the gills, so it goes into their body fat. The fish get eaten by other things, on up the food chain, finally reaching us. So that by the time those pollutants that were in very low concentrations in the water, like parts per trillion, parts per billion, by the time they made it to us, to our dinner plate, with our vegetables and our fish, our cattle, eating steak and whatever, they were in very high concentrations. They had been biomagnified. So the same thing happens at a sewage treatment plant. Sewage sludge, about a third of it is animal fat from animal operations, from restaurants where food is dumped, and it ends up in the sewage treatment plant, settling out there. So what you see at a sewage treatment plant, compared to what was in a river, is millions of times higher concentrations of particularly these chemicals we were worried about, the ones that are biomagnified, the ones that cause neurological disorders that we worry about today, from Alzheimer's to autism. These have been linked to these kinds of chemicals, the water-insoluble chemicals that are biomagnified. The reason being that they dissolve out into the fat and the nerves in the brain. So this is a huge concern for us. The more fat-soluble a chemical is, the more neurotoxic it is. So think about this. Think about the big picture of it. In 1970, we had a crisis. The year before and a few years before that, of water pollutants getting so bad that rivers were getting foul. Fish were turning belly up in the rivers from fish killed. Cuyahoga River was catching on fire. But think about that problem this way. We had very low concentrations of these chemicals we worry about in the rivers. And so we took that problem, which was coming through a pipe from some factory and spilling into the river. So think about it this way. We have a pipe that contains all these pollutants in 1970. It's flowing from big industries. It's highly concentrated, but it goes into the river, and it's not very soluble. It starts flowing out the rivers into the oceans. So as far as human health was concerned, we had to worry about what was on our tables. We had to worry about the indirect exposure to these things in high concentrations. You'd have to work in a chemical plant or at a petroleum operation in order to be exposed to very high concentrations of these kind of chemicals. It'd be an occupational exposure. So the problem we had then really was quite simple. Our problem's in a pipe, all these chemicals. As a chemist, you would recognize at that time, and EPA was full of chemists, there were just a handful of microbiologists like me, but lots of engineers and lots of chemists. Any well-educated chemist or engineer would know that what's in that pipe going to that river, you could take it, go back to the chemical plant before it puts it in that pipe. That chemical plant could solve that problem by simply taking those chemical waste, heating them up at a very high temperature, adding lime to that first, so you raise the alkalinity or the pH, where it's the opposite of an acid, it becomes very alkaline. If you do that to all those chemicals in a tank where you can pressurize it, and for 20 or 30 minutes you heat it up at a high alkalinity, then what you've got left in a very short time, and this can be done economically, all those toxic chemicals, pesticides, PCBs, plasticizers, things that everybody who's interested in environmental issues knows about, they're gone. They're quickly broken down to the building blocks of life, ammonia, sulfate, the simple things that we all depend on, every living organism needs. So think about it, putting yourself back in 1970, and you've got a whole federal agency now, the EPA, that looks at a very simple problem, and the solution would be obvious, one would think, to any scientist. But what do? The big industry and their lobbyists, their trade associations get together with the EPA in Washington, D.C., the Office of Water, which writes these regulations, and they decide that the cheapest thing to do is just, since we've got a sewage treatment system across the country now, they wouldn't even have to build a pipe to a river. They've got sewers going right by their door. They can just dump all this hazardous waste in a sewer, and it'll take it to a sewage treatment plant. Their only problem was to deal with the sewage sludge, where all this stuff now that was in part per trillion, part per billion levels in the rivers is now millions of times higher concentration. All of these chemicals that we worried about in sewage sludge. So they worked on EPA's Office of Water to deregulate all of these things. Everything we regulate in air and water that or toxic chemicals, heavy metals and such, that are known, that scientists everywhere agree at very low concentrations cause neurological diseases, immune system problems, cancer. They cause birth defects through mutations. That's not questionable, never has been. They do it at very low concentration. So now they've got these things at millions of times higher concentration in sewage sludge. So what do they want done with it? They don't even want to put it in a tank and heat it up for 30 minutes and get rid of it, to where we would have actually solved pollution. We wouldn't be polluting the environment. Instead, we've created a federal agency, Congress has, whose job it is to regulate these things. Let's dump them in the river and regulate them. Of course, you've got literally millions of chemicals that come from the chemicals that pollute the environment and all their breakdown products. You've got just millions of these potentially toxic, cancer-causing, mutagenic chemicals at very high concentration. And the industry wants it just dumped out. Where? Anywhere. Farms, school playgrounds, golf courses, in the medians and interstate highways, home gardens, bag it up, put it in Home Depot. Get rid of it anywhere and market it as a fertilizer. That's what EPA's Office of Water wanted to do. So fortunately at that time, not true now, but in those days, a program office like the Office of Water at EPA could not pass a regulation on its own. The Office of Research and Development, where I worked, had to approve it. So it had to go out to all these scientists in the field at 12 different research laboratories, one of them in Athens, Georgia, 11 others scattered across the country, coast to coast, located near universities. And EPA's scientists looked at it and said, this doesn't make sense. Because EPA's Office of Water is saying, this is what we should do, it's not a problem. EPA's scientists were grappling with, how can this be? How can it be that we could take all these chemicals that we know cause all of these public health problems at extremely low concentrations, concentrate them 1,000,000 times, put them out everywhere where we live and work and play. And that's supposed to be safe. So what the scientists in EPA's Office of Research and Development did is go back to the Office of Water and say, where are the scientific data to show this is safe? And a conversation on the phone, I remember when it happened at our laboratory in Athens, when our research director, Bob Swank, asked the guy in the Office of Water who was in charge of this program to explain how this works. And the reply over the phone was, it's magic. And so it became called officially at EPA sludge magic. So EPA's scientists would not approve this rule. They held their ground till the Office of Water promised, the compromise that was reached is that they would fund the Office of Research and Development $2 million a year for 5 years to research this and see what the problems are and fix them if there are problems with this practice called land application of sewage sludge. Well, when President Clinton came into office in 1993, right at that time, February 1993, Office of Water releases its sludge rule. It was called the 503 sludge rule. And set about to create a body of science on its own with the wastewater treatment industry that would support this idea that taking all these pollutants and putting them on land where we all live and work and play is safe. The only way you could do that is to falsify the data. On the one hand, you have to put out unreliable data in the scientific literature to support such an idea. And on the other hand, you've got this other problem. You've got all these scientists all over EPA in these field laboratories that don't buy into this. And you got to keep them quiet. And so I happened to be one of the people that had to be kept quiet. What I did is organized a group of scientists, first at EPA and then later involved in some at the University of Georgia as well. And we went out and investigated reports of where people were getting sick, animals were dying, farm animals, house pets, wherever this sludge was spread around neighborhoods. And so we documented those in the scientific literature, and that became a problem internally within the EPA. The lines were drawn, and in a nutshell, there were people all the way to the top at EPA that took the side of the scientists at EPA that were concerned about this. But there were lots of scientists that took the industry side of this as well. So we've moved, if you look at the big picture of pollution in the United States, we've gone from a time when we had the pollution problem confined in a pipe going into a river, which was real easy to solve. We built sewage treatment plants, which we really needed. And so we transferred that problem, put it in another pipe, the sewage treatment lines that run down, it runs from your toilet, unless you've got a septic tank, you live in a municipality, it goes down to be collected at the sewage treatment plant. Big industry is dumping their hazardous waste in there as well. And EPA, in the meantime, has deregulated all of this, except for 9 heavy metals that they regulate today, lead and arsenic and mercury, a few others. All the chemicals in the world scientists ever worried about, toxic chemical, EPA deregulated. None of these chemicals that are in sewage sludge, at millions of times higher concentration than they were in the water and the air, are regulated now. They theoretically were regulated under the 503 sludge rule, that class of regulations before the 503 was passed. There were some reasonably strict regulations until before 1993. But when Bill Clinton came into office, this was not his problem and he didn't create it, but in his administration, his political appointees handled this. And suddenly we have a problem that was fixable in 1970, transformed in a problem we cannot fix. When the pollution problem's in a pipe, you can fix it. When it goes in a river, you can still deal with it. You've created a problem there. What should have been done, get rid of these chemicals. We need to stop pollution, not figure out how to regulate some tiny part of it. It's not going to help us at all. But suddenly EPA has made this a far bigger problem. It's now everywhere around us. So even then, as the pipe came, we changed pipes out and the pipe starts coming to the sewage treatment plant, even then we can deal with that. We could take that sewage sludge and do the same thing to it that the chemical plant should have done with the chemicals in the first place, put it in a big steel container, heat it up under pressure with some lime in it. And it even has an advantage, sewage sludge. It's got a lot of organic material in it. It's got a lot of carbon in it. You know, the carbon we worry about in the atmosphere with climate change, CO2, when it's in plants and animal waste and whatever that's in sewage sludge, it's organic carbon. Once you put that in the big tank and heat it up under pressure and add the lime, you can convert that into charcoal. And what that does, that locks up the carbon for thousands or hundreds of thousands or potentially millions of years. It's not going to go up in the atmosphere. What a great idea it would have been when Jimmy Carter had sewage treatment plants built. Let's take all this super toxic stuff we've created now to clean up the water. Let's put it in this tank. Not only do we get rid of these toxic chemicals we were worried about, but we can also extract our heavy metals back out of that. Whatever residual heavy metals are there would be tied up. You could activate this carbon in it, just like we use activated carbon filters to clean our water. And so we could solve the pollution problem at the sewage treatment plant. But industry does not want to go to any expense, if they can, and they got the best deal of all. The sewage sludge is not regulated, and we're going to spread it out everywhere. So it goes out on the land, and it runs back off in the rivers and lakes, ends up where we started out, with an even worse problem, because now the toxic chemicals are on particles of sewage sludge at far higher concentrations to go into drinking water in private wells, and whoever drinks the water there, they're getting a worse dose of pollution. But it's also going into the groundwater. It's also drying out on these fields and blowing in the air everywhere. That's the problem we saw, where people were getting sick, and some children died in sites that we looked at with this, mainly from inhaling the dust of this stuff. So that is what we've done. So what I wanted to talk about, the problem we've now got to turn this around, on top of all this, is during that period of time when the EPA got together with the industry, is that they created this whole body of science to support the idea that spreading all these pollutants at high concentrations around us does not harm anybody. Humans, animals, doesn't harm the environment. And so the way EPA did that, they gave out a grant, a cooperative agreement it's called actually, to the Water Environment Federation, which represents all these chemical companies and wastewater treatment plants, to fund universities, specifically land-grant universities, agricultural colleges, to produce research papers showing this was safe. And they looked specifically for scientists at universities who were interested in working on this area. And in my own experience, I noticed that the scientists that they would pick to do a lot of this work, they were great in agriculture, but they weren't the best chemical engineers or chemists or microbiologists around. EPA did not engage the types of scientists that it had working for its own agency who excelled in these areas. And they managed to develop a collection of scientists over 20 years that love to do research on sewage sludge and sing its praises in in scientific journals that would publish their work. But to read just from the document, what EPA and the wastewater industry call the National Biosolids Public Acceptance Campaign. EPA's Office of Water said that the National Biosolids Public Acceptance, and that's what they call this material, biosolids. That's their name of their free fertilizer or cheap fertilizer from sewage slides. The purpose of this program was to gain acceptance of the science and the substance of the Part 503 rule, the sludge rule, and overcome misinformation spread by opponents. Its goal was to make biosolids non-controversial by the year 2000. And they focused on discrediting any scientific studies that indicated any problem, any health problems. And here's a quote from the Office of Water and the Wastewater Environment Federation's cooperative agreement. Unsubstantiated claims of horror stories that have been attributed to the use of biosolids are an important weapon of groups that are opposed to the use of biosolids. WEF, the Water Environment Federation, will assemble and evaluate information that fully explains what really occurred. That's EPA's agreement. Before any studies are done, before any problems are looked at, they've already agreed that if they indicate health problems, we're going to put together the information that shows what really happened, which was nobody got sick, nobody died from this. And here's how bad it got. This was worked out with the U.S. Department of Agriculture with a scientist by the name of Rufus Cheney in Beltsville, Maryland. He was at the top of the USDA. He used to publish studies for 15 years. He published studies on how toxic sewage sludge was. And he documented farm animals dying from it. But he was approached and offered a top position at USDA to run this program to promote biosolids as safe. And here's a quote from him in a deposition. He was questioned about a study that was published where a federal judge, and this was a study that I was involved with indirectly, and I was involved with the site where dairy cows were dying on a field where sludge was applied. And a federal judge who took the case discovered in the depositions of the wastewater treatment plant, this happened right down in Augusta, Georgia, that the plant manager admitted during a deposition that he actually made up all of this data. 20 years of environmental monitoring data collected by the EPA, it was collected by the wastewater treatment plant and given to EPA, was recreated. The wastewater treatment plant and EPA lost somehow, all of a sudden, all of the data for 20 years that went on these farms with Augusta sludge. And the plant manager of the wastewater treatment plant said under oath that he sat down at his computer and recreated 20 years of data, gave it to EPA. EPA flew down to Georgia, drove over to the wastewater treatment plant, got these data, gave them to the University of Georgia, and they were published in a scientific journal. So the point being here that when the head scientist at USDA is asked about the fabricated data, because USDA and EPA went on to defend the data, even though they admitted the data had been fabricated, which seems like it's unbelievable. But here's what Rufus Cheney said when he was asked, by the attorney asked, so Rufus Cheney says, the researcher could have totally made up all that data and you still rely on it because it's a peer-reviewed study. Is that accurate? And Rufus Cheney says, as long as it was in general agreement with the general patterns established by hundreds of papers. So it's okay to fake data. And this is just one sample. We have a whole body of data that has been created to support this practice. The problem here that has been created out of the fabrication of data over 20 years of publishing biased data is that it's not simply that we have higher concentrations of lead or PCBs or some pesticide now all around us than we ever had before EPA was created. We have them all mixed together. Just imagine going to your pharmaceutical company or your local drugstore and taking every drug on the shelf and mixing it together. People die from mixing 2 or 3 things together. Think about it. We've taken every pollutant there is that flows into New York City from all the industries, mix it all together, and then spread it out on farms and school playgrounds, you name it, where all these pollutants are no longer regulated. We don't even know where they're going, what's in it. You reach a point in the big picture things here to where you do this, to where you mix together every toxic chemical that we know of, every cancer-causing agent, every mutagen that causes birth defects, everything that causes neurological disorders. We mix all disorders. We mix all of these together at millions of high concentration. We spread them out everywhere. You reach a point at which you see what apparently we're already beginning to see. Alzheimer's, ALS, Parkinson's, autism's come out of nowhere, neurological diseases on the increase, cancer on the increase, cancer appearing in younger and younger people. Teenagers get colon cancer now. 15 years ago, doctors never saw a patient, a teenager with colon cancer. So all the while, this continues on. Jimmy Carter, when he created this system, warned Congress that we've got to make sure here that we're not creating a bigger problem than we already had, or a different problem. And we've got to keep considering alternatives to this. But we've had 5 presidents come and go since Jimmy Carter. And they've appointed all their heads of agencies. Nobody's fixed this problem. That's how important it is where we are now in an election. We've got to get the word to whoever wins this election that enough is enough. We know how to fix this problem. They keep talking about the environment. We keep paying taxes to federal agencies to deal with this, but everywhere we look, people are getting sicker. And that's where we come in, each of us here. And Pope Francis, in establishing Laudato Si in his second encyclical to call upon Catholics and others to make the environment a priority, and to solve these problems, we've got to get word to whoever's elected, Republican or Democrat, that we want this problem fixed. And so we're videotaping this presentation, for example. We'll give you a link you can share and send that message to your congressman, to the White House. We want this problem fixed. We want these pollutants not spread all around us in sewage sludge. We want them destroyed. We have the technology to do it. It's simple, it's quick. Let's stop pollution. So what we're going to do now, that wraps up my lecture. We'll take a few questions. This is Professor David Gaddy in the School of Engineering. Did I get that right? University of Georgia. And David King, who's a chemical engineer, worked for Dow Chemical Company, cleaning up hazardous waste sites, and myself.
Thank you. This was, I think, eye-opening to a lot of us. Raises a lot of questions too. I am utterly ignorant of this supply stream and the stream of what you discussed. Where does sludge come from? Where does it go? What is the extent of this problem? If you could maybe spend 30 seconds and just tell us what this looks like. And then I'd also like to know what is the standards in other developed countries for dealing with sludge. What do they do in the EU? What do they do in Canada? What do they do in Japan? Is this a uniquely American problem? If you could address those two issues, I'd appreciate that.
Sure. At a wastewater treatment plant, the solid material that settles out is mostly human feces. That makes up, that plus water makes up mostly what sludge is. The other stuff strained out of it, plastics and whatever. And so that material is taken, and most of it is, they just add lime to it to raise the pH, to reduce the odors and levels of certain bacteria in it. And then it's taken from there and spread in tons per acre on land. At the current time... Fill me in on that gap. Who spreads it on land? How does it go from Athens-Clark waste treatment plant? Where does it go then? And who is they? And the sludge, the municipalities, the wastewater treatment plants that generate it, develop contracts with sludge haulers that come out there in trucks and pick it up, and have contracts with the city. They carry it out to where it's going to be disposed of on a farm or golf course or wherever. And currently, and they apply it at tons per acre. So we're not talking about a small amount. It's not like you normally apply fertilizer. You go to a 10,000 acre farm and it's inches deep on the surface in sewage sludge. Currently, somewhere around 60% or more of all the sewage sludge in the country is applied to land. Mostly by this practice, add some lime to it, go out and spread it. And so, think about it, every municipality across the country, every city, every town, every community with a sewage treatment plant is taking all of this material and spreading it around them on the land. So that gives you an idea of the scope of the problem.
I don't mean to drill or nothing, but where's the economy and the market here? Who wants this stuff spread on their land? I don't understand the economic flow here either. I don't mean to harp the point. I'm really missing a big thing here. Who wants this stuff on their land? Who's receiving it and why? What's in it for them?
For the farmers, they save quite a bit of money by not buying commercial fertilizers to use this. They are approached by the city or the sludge hauling companies, given a stack of scientific articles saying that this is safe, and that it not only is safe, it improves your soil, improves your crop yields. So they go for it and put up with their neighbors complaining about headaches and vomiting and whatever from breathing the dust and the gases that come off of it. What was your second part of that question?
My second part, I guess I was wanting to know what are the regulatory standards in other developed countries like the EU?
Oh yeah, right. That's been an evolving situation. There are countries that do not permit land application sewage sludge at this point. Yeah. there are countries that do not, in Europe, that do not allow land application sewage sludge. In the United States, it's universal in every state. Same for Canada. So the rest of the world, particularly underdeveloped areas, are following the EPA's lead on this.
I'm a scientist at UGA.
A better one than I am.
Well, I won't say that, but I run my program off of competitive U.S. government grants. Mm-hmm. And I just feel compelled to put out there a cautionary balance to some of your comments, David. I don't want to, what I find is equally damaging problem in our society is scientific cynicism and an anti-science bias in our publics, which I find at least equally dangerous to the cautionary tone that you're presenting for the existence of bias. It's like a road with a ditch on both sides, and we don't want to be in either ditch. We need a vigilant citizenry who is open to both extremes. And I just don't want this group to think that scientists and science is systematically and totally biased, though we can't deny that does happen. The alternative would be strictly private funding from Dow, Elanco, and the chemical companies directly, without any political correction in between, which our federal agencies do allow some of that. So the alternative, I find frightening. And being in the College of Ag as I am, it's very tempting to go to Monsanto or some of the big, inks and get my money straight from them, and then I would really be vulnerable to bias. Yeah. But the U.S. Department of Agriculture at least is a correcting moderator to that process. So I would much rather get my funding from the federal government than from big Inc. directly. And I'm just saying we need to be cautious about science cynicism, because what's the alternative? Ignorance? And so I'm very careful. I'm a very strong advocate for science, and I have to speak out a little bit to defend that extreme as well.
Have you ever worked for a research agency, a scientific research agency?
I've never worked for USDA, but I worked for the College of Agriculture, and we run our programs off of competitive USDA and NSF and NIH.
I don't think that, other than somebody like me that has spent 15 years experiencing and studying this and gathering the data on it, realizes after I published a 2-page paper in Nature in 1996 titled EPA Science Casualty Election Politics, the Union of Concerned Scientists surveyed 5,000 scientists at EPA. And you know what they found? Over half of them said that within the last 5 years, they had been asked by program offices to change their conclusions to support government policies. And this is really the tip of the iceberg. It is so pervasive that it's unimaginable to somebody outside the life I've lived, the people I've worked with, the data that I've gathered on this. The fake data side of this is not even the biggest problem.
So your earlier question about Paris was about, it was the Paris climate agreement with 196 countries, and that was a CO2 issue. And that was a lot of what prompted Pope Francis's Laudato Si. And David had mentioned about CO2 from smokestacks. The issue about CO2 is really not a simple issue. It's a very difficult, globally pervasive problem. And there's a lot of work that's being done, particularly by industry, to try and do carbon capture and storage. And just so I'll at least get a couple of comments in here on that, because I'm not able to get into the chemistry of the things that these guys are talking about. But part of the reason that we're facing such an issue with that is not so much what's going on here in the U.S. with CO2. Ours is kind of flatlined, but when we look at developing countries, particularly when it comes to China, who's now leading the world in CO2 emissions, and India, who is number 3 after us. We have a real global issue to deal with, allowing these countries to develop economically. We've got 2.3 billion people in the world that don't have access to energy, nearly 2 billion that don't have any electricity. In India alone, and again, I've been there and I've been to China both, the conditions are deplorable. They're horrible. And how we are going to get those countries not only energy, but quality electricity so that they can build their economies and feed their people, 700 million of whom are in poverty, is a significant challenge, and it's something that the U.S., in my opinion, really needs to focus their technology on. If it doesn't work in India, Vietnam, Thailand, we shouldn't be pursuing it. So just real quickly to your point, we're in our coal issue now because there was actually a federal act passed back in the 70s that got us off of gas and demanded that we burn coal. Now we're facing, 40 years later, another problem. And to that point, I would recommend strongly that what we do is we focus on clean nuclear energy, renewables, and low-carbon gas for these countries so that they can build their economies, not allow India to do what China did and ramp this CO2 up to where they're double what ours is now. So, but there is a lot of work being done globally on carbon capture and storage. A lot of it's down in Australia. We're trying to do some here in the U.S. There's a plant going under construction in Mississippi. It's been very expensive. It's catching a lot of grief for that, I know, but it's still efforts are being made to try and address a problem. It's just not going to be easy to solve. They deserve a chance to feed their people and to grow economically, and we need to help them do that.
We really should, not to sound like taking sides, but I guess I must, because we need to distinguish between the research part of EPA and the regulatory part of EPA. The research part of EPA is supposed to do good quality science so that the regulations are based on solid science. And I will claim, and I think you would agree, the research labs do that.
They do a great job at it.
What happens to some of that, it gets stifled sometimes, they're not allowed to publish it, and things like that. But in the specific case of the sludge rule, as you alluded to, but maybe it kind of got lost in the shuffle, or the Office of Research and Development refused to approve it. And then there were these negotiations, which I actually was a part of for a certain part of it, where the research part of EPA said, if you will study this, I think there were 5 distinct efforts.
6 total.
6, okay, my memory fails. That only because the regulatory office said they would fund those 6 studies. And it wasn't just the Athens lab, it was 4 or 5 of the labs that reviewed it. Each one reviewed their particular expertise worth because each one of them specializes. So in the end, it never worked out the way it was supposed to. The money never came, the research never got done, except for a tiny little amount, and they just, went like a steamroller over us. And that does happen, and it's appalling. However, one last comment is, if you look back in the early 70s, when the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act were first passed, and what water and air in particular were like then, compared to what they are now in this country, or if you go to someplace like China and compare, I mean, you can't even open your eyes in China without them burning. I've been there many times. But anyway, so we have to admit, too, that we've come a long way due to the environmental regulations. But there are major, major gaps, one of them being land, like you said, and the other being things of mixtures, which is very, very complex and hard to study, but it can be, and there are instances where it has been. So when NIEHS says they can't, maybe they should take another look.
Absolutely.
Do reverse osmosis water filters improve or cleanse the metals out of the, say, well water?
I'm going to let David King, the chemical engineer, answer that better than I can.
The answer is not entirely, to some extent. If you've got a heavily polluted well with heavy metals and organic compounds in it, you will reduce it to some extent, but you will not take it all out. Activated charcoal, activated carbon, is actually better in a lot of cases than reverse osmosis. Yeah, I think that is. I'm not sure what they use, but this stuff here is pretty good because it's been distilled or it's tested. But like David said, you probably don't need to worry about this if you just get your well tested. In most cases, if you've got a good deep well, not a 40-foot deep well, but a 500 or a 300 or 700-foot deep well, you've had enough filtering of the water through the soil and land that your water's okay. So I wouldn't go install a reverse osmosis or water filtering thing unless I got my well water tested and it said I needed to.
Right here.
Yeah.
Is there any kind of, on an engineer aspect for any new developments or existing developments, is there any sort of incentives to operate differently? Like say, hey, now I'm ahead of the waste management program. Why are we doing this? Let's burn it. Like, are there any incentives, or is it that just kind of by the wayside for any kind of company or management sewer systems or anybody? Is there any incentives to do something different?
There is no incentive to do anything differently, and the innovative people that I've met, and I'm working with a couple of companies now, volunteering to help them work on this problem, that want to take on this issue because they think it's a travesty. But the obstacles that they face in tackling this problem, when EPA and the industry has just won it hands down, and the Department of Agriculture, the federal regulations are so solid that it leaves little incentive. And worse than that, one of these companies, I don't want to name the company, actually approached a major energy company, whose name I won't mention, but one of the biggest energy companies in the United States, about their process to convert this material. And they could take it from smokestacks at coal-fired plants, for example, and take all of that waste that's in there glued to the walls and caking up and coming out, all this fly ash and whatever. They could take that, add leaf litter and stuff to it, run it through this process, end up with charcoal, so that those energy plants aren't putting out CO2 in the atmosphere. Let's capture that and put it out in charcoal. We can put it in the soil. The carbon's locked up there for thousands or hundreds of thousands or more years to help solve our climate change problem. And that big energy company was very interested in it and came back and made them an offer to keep quiet. All they want to do is buy that process so it never got used. I have found in working with big corporations that are making a lot of money, they don't want anything to upset the apple cart. This is David Gaddy's area, knows more about economics and engineering and so forth than I do. But he turned down the offer. He said, you don't have enough money to pay me to silence this, put the lid on this. But that's what we're up against. I think that my own idea about I look at it like the polio epidemic. Having had a little brother who got polio and having some memory of what those days were like, when FDR hooked up with Jonas Salk, I don't know if you've ever read that story, but there you had the President of the United States sold on some scientist, Jonas Salk, and there were other scientists who had other ideas about how to deal with polio. But FDR was sold on the Salk vaccine. And he got behind Jonas Salk and brought down every barrier to it. And they had a vaccine out in no time. In my case, one of the papers that I published in 1999 was co-authored by someone working in the White House, a scientist. And I asked him, I said, have you talked to Carol Browner, the EPA administrator, about what's going on at EPA? Not only this area, but other areas. And he said, David, I've been over and over and over with her about this. And all she will say is she's overruled at the highest level. And I said, what is the highest level? Was she talking about the president? And Carol Browner was a super nice person. I got an award that in Washington, she went out of her way as federal employees cycled by to get their science awards, and she stopped the whole show and took me aside and talked for me 5 minutes, telling me how important my work was at EPA. And so Carol Browner, the EPA administrator, was not the problem. But my friend in the White House said no, that the President of the United States had no idea what EPA is doing on issues like this. Somewhere in between, some White House office. But I think that's what we've got to get here. We've got to get some scientist somewhere who understands these problems, that's connected to the various highest level, like FDR and Jonas Salk, and solve this thing. It's so easy to solve in a short period of time.
So we're emitting a lot of these chemicals, I guess from pharmaceuticals that we use in our households, very common daily items, and we're breaking them down in the sewage treatment plant. And as you said before, they're becoming simpler chemicals. And as you insinuated, a lot of these are absorbed by organisms such as the fish and others. And then I like to think about the microorganisms because I do a lot of studies with that at UGA. And it seems that, I don't know, would you say there's like a heightened concentration of possible pathogens in our waterways if we were to have all these excess nutrients, no matter what kind of form? And these microorganisms are kind of opportunistic, feeding on these nutrients.
Actually, I'm working with the National Institute of Standards and Technology at the Hollings Marine Lab in Charleston. And I met with the director of NIEHS several months ago, and that was the subject of our conversation, Linda Birnbaum. And she has since fast-tracked 5 proposals we put together on that. And what we're stressing is that exactly what you're talking about. We have to look at the mixtures of microorganisms, algae, bacteria, fungi, what they do together. We have to look at what chemicals do together. We've got, you can take mixtures of chemicals, none of which cause cancer. You mix them together, and they're carcinogenic. They're chemicals that alone do not harm the blood-brain barrier. Mix them together, and they diminish the blood-brain barrier's capacity to filter things out before they get into our brains. There are things that don't cause mutations individually, but you mix them together and they are very mutagenic. That's the real world that we live in, whereas EPA is still looking at, well, this chemical is mutagenic, let's regulate it. What about all the chemicals that are not mutagenic, that are all mixed out there in a toxic soup? we live in an ocean of pollutants, which wherever you go, it's mutagenic, it's carcinogenic, it causes neurological disorders. The collective soup of innumerable chemicals. And we're pretending that doesn't exist. Everybody talks about it. We need to do studies on complex mixtures of microorganisms and chemicals.
Thank you for the great speech that you gave. It informed everybody. But as you know, I found out the hard way about biosolids when I purchased compost from the Athens-Clarke County landfill, and I thought the awful smell was chicken manure. Nobody informed me that my compost contained sludge or biosolids. So I learned out the hard way and had ringworm, and one of my cats died, and you guys came out and tested my soil, and we'll get the results back soon. But my big question is, I would like everybody to know and understand that they changed the definition of compost. The compost we grew up with that didn't include human waste. How is anybody to know that they changed the definition of compost? And at Athens-Clarke County, you're talking about the land where they take the biosolids out and they spread it on the land. What's the concentration in the compost I got as compared, and the density and the closeness to the house? Does that make it 10 times more potent when you put it in that concentration and put it up against your house or in your yard as opposed to spreading it on the pasture?
Yes, the families that we studied when we looked at this problem, a lot of them had the sludge spread around their houses. The larger problem is, if you go down to the paint store and buy a gallon of paint, and you take that paint out, paint the lid off the can and stick a brush in it and take it out, you can smell the paint. But if you paint a room with it, it's overwhelming. So think of it in that way. In your case, this is Ms. Black, who actually had a cat die. 2 others get sick after this stuff was spread around her place. In your case, it's just 2 truckloads that was spread, is that right, around your house, close to under the windows, etc. That's sort of like the paint when you pour it in the little roller pan. You're getting a certain level of exposure there. But if you were to have a big operation come into your neighborhood and spread it over 10 or 20 acres of land, it's like painting that whole room. That's where you see really serious problems, public health-wise, respiratory diseases, gastrointestinal problems, skin infections like you got after spreading that without any gloves on because they didn't tell you what they sold you.
We had a wonderful lecture by Dr. David Lewis, and I could tell by the amount of questions, the quality of questions and responses and the going back and forth that you really hit a nerve. And that was a necessary nerve to hit.
Made it worth it.
And so I really thank you for that. I thank you all for coming down. And you just tied in a lot about faith and what the Pope is trying to do, and also our local Archbishop Gregory, with his action plan based on Laudato Si. It's not our faith, Christianity, is not just pie-in-the-sky futuristic stuff. It's concerned with, and has to be concerned with, the here and the now. If we're really not taking care of our earthly homeland, what is that going to mean for when we inherit, hopefully, our heavenly homeland? Yeah. Okay, so I just thank you very much, and I just ask everybody to give Dr. Lewis a round of applause.
and our guests here, the experts. Thank you very much.